Okay, I think I'm live. Let's check my microphone levels. We're looking pretty good. Okay, so welcome back to Ethics and Society, PHIL-1009, Fanshawe College in the summer of 2020. This is this Thursday's live stream for week 6. A couple of small notes here. Most of you, in fact, the vast majority of you have submitted your first short essay assignment. I will be grading those hopefully over this weekend. And we'll get those grades out to you. If you have not submitted it yet, send me an email. It's not too late. Just tell me, why it's a little bit late, and I'm sure we'll find a way to kind of accommodate. And I just want that essay in. To me, it's more important that you do the work, even if it's a bit late. Also want to direct your attention to online quiz number 2 over here. And up next, of course, will be the online midterm test. So these are the next things to think about. Online quiz 2 is open right now. Online midterm test, June 15th. After the break, the class will be taken over by Dr. Ed Matthews, great guy, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the class just as much. This week is a week where the online format of the class is a little bit detrimental, I think, to the topic, because when we're talking about an applied ethics case, now that we've done a little bit of moral philosophy, we've thought about it in the abstract, and we want to do applied ethics, which is thinking of cases. It's so much better to be in a classroom, because then we can kind of have this argument, and I don't have that many slides for euthanasia, and usually I don't, because what I want to do is just kind of have a discussion that is guided by the content, but not a lecture. Unfortunately, this summer we're online, and if we were in class, we'd have a conversation, but instead I'm just going to run through the slides and I'll open up the discussion forum. Maybe if you want to go in there, you can. You're not graded on. There's no discussion forum points or anything, so you're not graded on discussion forums. So, but if you want to go in there and talk about it, that's something you can definitely do. So again, this week we are going to be talking about something called applied ethics in the context of the issue of euthanasia. Now, what do we mean when we say applied ethics? Well, this is the branch of ethics concerned. This is Wikipedia's definition, which is great. I love Wikipedia for philosophy, especially intro courses. I think the articles are pretty good. It's the branch of ethics concerned with the analysis of specific particular moral issues in private and public life. So we're not doing theory, we are actually doing practice. And applied ethics, practical ethics, has to take into account not just what we do ideally, but how we implement things and the impact these implementations have in reality. So we can't just talk about things in the abstract. We have to see, well, how is it implemented in fact? So examples here, right, in bioethics, biomedical ethics is probably the best known applied ethics category, right? There's always issues in medicine, in the life sciences. Euthanasia is a big one. How to allocate health resources. For example, during this pandemic, countries that had their health systems overwhelmed by COVID-19 had to make really difficult decisions about the allocation of ventilators. And often the decision would be we should give them to people with the highest chance of survival. But is this the right thing to do? Well, that's a moral issue. So outside of kind of biomedical ethics, right, there's environmental ethics, ecological issues, for example, about pollution, about the value of nature outside of its relation to its usefulness to us. Right? Business ethics is another applied ethics category, right? For example, about the duties of whistleblowers to the general public or loyalty of employees to their employers, right? These are all kinds of examples of applied ethics. The reading for this one here, so if you're still following with the textbook, is Rachel's article about the morality of euthanasia. So what is euthanasia if you're not familiar with this debate? Euthanasia has to do with the issue of whether or not it should be not just legal, but kind of accessible, right, and possible for a terminally ill patient to choose to die rather than let the illness take its course and eventually die of it. So, for example, we might think of a situation like a lethal injection, where somebody asks to die in what they hope would be a less painful, more dignified way than to let a terminal illness run its course. And this is a controversial issue. Canada has now a framework for euthanasia. Some of you might be familiar with this new framework. I'll be talking about that. And the argument for it, Rachel says, is an argument from mercy. And the idea here is that James Rachels in this article is going to argue that a terminally ill patient is in such incomprehensible suffering that should they wish it, right, it should be permissible for them to be allowed to die a medically supervised and less painful or maybe even painless death. That's obviously a very controversial issue. So, as Rachel puts it in the article, and this is a quote from Rachel's, if a person prefers death as the only alternative to lingering on in a certain kind of torment, only to die anyway after a while, surely it is not immoral to help this person die sooner. Right? So notice the conditions put on this claim of Rachel's. Right? Death is the only alternative to lingering on in torment, to die anyway after a while. So in this case, we have to meet two conditions for euthanasia to be morally permissible, according to Rachel's, right? That there's suffering, and death is also a medical inevitability, right? So both of these conditions have to be present. Death is the only alternative because otherwise there will definitely be suffering, and death is inevitable anyway. And he says if these conditions are met, then it is not immoral to help this person die sooner. Now, again, as I've said earlier, you might already know that in Canada, there is a framework for assisted dying. Under Canadian law, a person can access medical assistance in dying, and there's an only if claim here. Not if, but only if they meet all of the following criteria. So there's an only if claim here, which means that these are the only situations in which it's permissible, and all these conditions have to hold. So you have to be eligible for health services funded by a government in Canada. So you have to already be like on OHIP or something. Second condition. They are 18 years of age and capable of making decisions with respect for their health. This is a tricky one, right? Because obviously if you're in a lot of suffering or you have a terminal illness, the notion of informed consent becomes very tricky to evaluate sometimes. But again, the legislation states that you have to be an adult and you have to be capable of making health decisions on your own. Condition 3, and all of these conditions have to be met. You have a grievous and irremediable medical condition. Right? Grievous means it is terminal, and irremediable means it is not curable. They have made a voluntary request. Right? This is condition 4, condition D, for medical assistance that was not made as a result of external pressure. Right? So you need to investigate and make sure that there isn't someone, a family member perhaps, manipulating the person requesting it because they want an inheritance or something like that, or because they're worried they're going to be a burden. So you have to make sure that that isn't the case somehow. Which, again, these conditions can be hard to meet and prove. And they give informed consent to receive medical assistance after having been informed of the means that are available to relieve their suffering, including palliative care. So they are aware of the options at that point, right? They know that palliative care is available, that there are certain drugs or therapies available, and they have to have informed consent, in other words, is also to really understand what alternatives are available, what your choices really are. So you need to meet these 5 conditions to access medical assistance in dying, at least in Canada. If you're interested more about the situation in Canada, and I think the situation is always a bit evolving as case law kind of cleans up the messy, the messier kind of situations. You can click on the link here to find out more. And of course, because it's law, I think I'm teaching to the law clerk program, so I'm not a lawyer by trade. I did my PhD in philosophy, so I'm not an expert here by any means. However, of course, terms like grievous and irremediable themselves have to be defined, because you can't have just like vague legislation. So what does it mean in condition C here, grievous and irremediable? Well, it means it's serious and incurable. They're in an advanced state of irreversible decline in capability, which is interesting because this condition kind of pushes up against the possibility of consent. Putting that to the side, though, right? And there's enduring physical or psychological suffering that is intolerable and cannot be relieved, and that natural death has become reasonably foreseeable, taking into account all of their medical circumstances. So natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. So it's not just that you're suffering, it's also that death is going to occur even with intervention within a reasonably foreseeable time frame. Even if you don't have a specific length of time, right? You don't know if it's going to be 6 months or a year, but as long as we can reasonably foresee death as occurring, even with continued medical intervention, then we have a grievous and irremediable condition, which is going to be a condition to access euthanasia. So we've talked a little bit about utilitarianism. Now Rachel's is going to give you a utilitarian argument for euthanasia. Now utilitarianism is the view that when it comes to moral evaluations, what matters is the outcome, what matters is the consequence, and the kinds of outcomes we should be chasing, the kinds of outcomes we want, are the ones where we relieve suffering and increase happiness. Sometimes it's not possible to increase happiness. Sometimes all we can do is relieve suffering. So utilitarianism, right, will say an action is moral, again, if it increases happiness, immoral if it increases misery. And we should evaluate outcomes in terms of the reduction of suffering and the increasing of happiness or pleasure. Nothing else. Really, this is what should be our prime consideration here. And if we... For the utilitarian, you can raise your hand and say, look, I disagree with euthanasia because it violates the dignity and sanctity of life. The utilitarian will say, that is not something that I could put in my calculations, because my calculations are focused on the reduction of suffering and the increasing of pleasure. I can only evaluate the dignity of or sanctity of life argument in as much as taking seriously the idea of the sanctity of life increases happiness and decreases suffering. But in itself, in and of itself, these concepts don't figure into my calculations, the utilitarian says. So the policy of killing hopelessly ill patients at their own request who are suffering great pain would decrease the amount of misery in the world, and therefore such a policy would be morally right. Because I have a theory that says what matters is reducing suffering and increasing pleasure. Now, of course, euthanasia doesn't increase pleasure because after you're dead, there's nothing to suffer or to be pleased. However, it does reduce suffering. So it is morally right from the utilitarian point of view. Now, as I've said, utilitarianism is, in a way, a narrow theory that asks us to reconsider everything in terms of suffering and pleasure. It doesn't take into account other values. It is not focused on human rights, except as a way of increasing happiness and reducing suffering. It doesn't care about freedom or justice, right? It doesn't factor these things in. These things are only good to the extent that they, what am I trying to say here? They're only good to the extent that they help us reduce suffering. Suppose a person is leading a miserable life but does not want to die. This person thinks a miserable life is better than none at all. I assume that we would all agree the person should not be killed. So the objection someone is presenting to Rachel's here, and Rachel's accepts the objection, is saying, look, if the utilitarian really only cares about decreasing suffering, under the conditions where euthanasia is morally acceptable, why does individual autonomy matter? Why does consent matter? Because if death is reasonably foreseeable and someone is suffering, then we can reduce the amount of suffering in the world by killing them, whether or not they consent, and then there'd be less suffering in the world. However, Rachel says we should respect a person's autonomy independently of the consequences, which seems to be an argument or a viewpoint that conflicts with strict utilitarianism. How do we reconcile this objection with Rachel's acceptance of it, yet his continued insistence on a utilitarian case for euthanasia? That's a good question. If you think back to the slides on utilitarianism, we made a distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. And if you remember that distinction, it might give you a clue as to how to solve this problem. One way to approach it would be to say that rule utilitarianism, which looks to the consequences of rules overall, is better than act utilitarianism in the context of euthanasia, because a rule that says that you can be killed whenever you are suffering too much would make society as a whole unhappy, because everybody would be unhappy to have this rule applied to them, to not have the choice. So a society that does not have bodily autonomy, in, for example, euthanasia, is a society that on the whole is unhappier, because the collective unhappiness of not having bodily autonomy is actually going to be worse, more suffering in a way, than a situation where some people choose to suffer of their own volition. So giving people the option is what we would want from a rule utilitarianism context. Rachel's has a slightly different move, and I really wish Rachel's had the rule utilitarian argument rather than this one. For Rachel says, look, even if the promotion of happiness and the avoidance of misery are not the only morally important things, they're still very important. So when an action or social policy would decrease misery, is a very strong reason in its favor. So this is weird, because Rachel's kind of walks back a strictly utilitarian argument and says utilitarianism is just one very important moral thing. And I'd much rather he just kind of stick to his guns and say, no, I'm going to be utilitarian through and through here. But I mean, in the real world, again, because we're doing applied ethics, in the real world, we just have to balance different approaches to moral philosophy. So Rachel says, look, if we ensure that euthanasia is voluntary, we can use a utilitarian argument as long as it doesn't conflict with other deeply held moral principles, even if in the absence of a grand unifying theory of morality. I think you can give a strictly utilitarian account of euthanasia that respects bodily autonomy. But I'm not a utilitarian for all that. Just as a philosopher who likes consistency. From an applied ethics point of view, the reality is, in a society like Canada, a liberal democratic society where you have different political parties, different religious beliefs, people who don't have religious beliefs at all, you have to kind of do this practical reconciliation of the fact that there'll be other competing moral principles, and you have to kind of strike a balance between how important we think suffering, reducing suffering is, how important we think human rights are, right? And again, come to this constant balancing act, which we have to recalibrate decade after decade, century after century. So what Rachel's is doing is maybe less philosophically consistent, but that's fine, because what he's doing in the end is something more practical, which is saying, in any liberal democracy, we have to play a balancing act between different moral values, such as the reduction of suffering, bodily autonomy, human dignity, the sanctity of life. And where and how we strike that balance is constantly renegotiated, constantly recalibrated. So Rachel's revised argument to take into account the problem of autonomy is going to say, look, if an action promotes the best interests of everyone concerned and violates no one's rights, that action is morally acceptable. Right? So we have rights and interests. In some cases, and at least some cases, Euthanasia promotes best interests and violates no rights. Therefore, in at least some cases, euthanasia is morally acceptable. Notice in his formulation, he calls it active euthanasia. Active and passive euthanasia are tricky medical legal kind of definitions, which I probably should have opened up the slides with. But let me ask you a philosophical question, in a sense, about the difference between these two things. So active euthanasia is when you commit an act rather than let something happen. So the intentional termination of life is active euthanasia. So classic active euthanasia is like, here's an injection that I know the result is a reasonably foreseeable death. So I give you the sodium pentothal injection or whatever it is, and I know that I can reasonably foresee this will cause your death. That's active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is not when I do something, but I allow something to happen. The cessation of the employment of extraordinary means to prolong life when there is irrefutable evidence that death is imminent is passive euthanasia. What does that word salad mean? What does this complicated sentence mean? It says, I'm not going to give you a lethal injection. However, we can cease treatment, even if I know ceasing treatment will result in death. So I'm going to allow this to happen. I'm not going to give you an injection that will kill you directly. However, I will allow death to happen by not doing something anymore. Right? So it's the difference between doing something, causing X, and allowing X. Right? Now, some people don't think this distinction makes a lot of sense. Some philosophers have argued very strenuously that the doing versus allowing distinction is one devoid of moral content, especially if you're really focused on the outcome and the consequences. If you're a hardcore utilitarian and you're focused on the consequences, then whether you do something that results in X or allow X to happen, the outcome's the same, X, right? If I do something that results in death or I allow something to happen that results in death, the outcome is the same, death. So how could doing versus allowing be different? However, most of us do think there's a doing versus allowing distinction, right? That there's a difference between doing something that results in death and allowing a death to occur through non-intervention, because intervention has a cost. In fact, this whole principle underlies a lot of just war theory. So, for example, and again, you can dispute this, but I used to teach a class at Western on political violence and terrorism, and one of the things we discussed was just war theory in regards to the difference between terrorism and civilian casualties in wartime. And it was kind of the same distinction of doing versus allowing, that there's a difference between doing harm to civilians and allowing harm to civilians. So what the rules of engagement in warfare might say is that I can't target civilians directly, but if civilians get hurt during the course of ordinary military campaigns, what can you do? There's kind of a counterfactual here, because the difference between, again, according to this argument, I'm not saying it's the right argument, but according to this argument, the difference between terroristic violence and civilian casualties during ordinary war is that if a military able to avoid civilian casualties would do so if it were able to, right? So suppose you want to bomb a munitions factory, it's World War II, but by bombing the munitions factory, you're probably going to kill 200 civilians. If you ask the general, hey, would you bomb the factory? What would you prefer, bomb the factory and kill 200 civilians, or bomb the factory and no civilians die? The general would say, well, I prefer the scenario where no civilians die, but that's not possible. But the difference between that and a terrorist would be like, no, the point is to kill civilians. There's no counterfactual, and that's why terrorist violence is worse than civilian casualties. So the argument goes between doing harm directly and allowing harm to occur as a consequence of your actions. Does this distinction make sense? Well, here's an article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on that very topic, doing versus allowing. Again, if this was a classroom, this is where we would stop. We'd have an argument. Some people would raise hands. But we're not. It's just something for you to think about at home, right? Doing versus allowing. Now, when it comes to this distinction in the context of euthanasia, it has been pretty uncontroversial that passive euthanasia can sometimes be justified, and in fact has been justified more easily, more frequently than active euthanasia. In fact, passive euthanasia sort of happens all the time outside of a legislative framework specifically allowing it. The reason is that adults generally have a right to refuse medical treatment, even if it results in a foreseeable death, because we believe in a right to bodily autonomy. Adults can refuse life-saving medical treatment. Right? There are religious groups that don't believe in blood transfusions. And if you refuse a blood transfusion, that is your legal right as an adult, even if you're going to die. So when it comes to passive euthanasia, it's not euthanasia at all, some people say. It's just an adult refusing further medical treatment. So a patient who knows they are dying can just refuse treatment, even when death is the foreseeable outcome, because it is in their bodily autonomy to refuse medical treatment. A doctor can't force medical treatment on them, which is probably right and good. It's active euthanasia where things get more controversial, because here death isn't a side effect of a person ceasing treatment. It is in fact the primary intent of the actual intervention. But if we're going to allow people to refuse treatment, the argument goes, why force them to prolong their suffering? If I'm going to cease treatment in the hopes that I die, and it's going to take me a few weeks for the cancer or whatever to kill me, well, why don't you just give me an injection and just kind of, why prolong the agony, as it were, for what reason? So, for what reason indeed? So let's talk a little bit about the wrongfulness of euthanasia, counter-arguments. So, in this article, G.K. Williams outlines kind of the standard objections here. So there's going to be 5 of them against this kind of utilitarian plus bodily autonomy argument. And the focus is going to be on active euthanasia. Of course, there are passive cases where the issue is kind of similar. Issues where, for example, the person is on extraordinary life support and is unable to communicate their intent. So you might have signed a DNR, a do not resuscitate, or you might have a will or medical directives stating you do not want to be on life support, which are decisions you make while of sound mind and body. But in absence of these directives, it becomes a kind of an ethical minefield whether or not the next of kin has the right to make these decisions. But putting these kind of consent issues to the side, we can just talk about whether or not active euthanasia is wrong, and whether or not the Gay-Williams arguments are stronger than the Rachel's arguments, right? Rachel's was utilitarianism plus bodily autonomy means active euthanasia is at least okay in at least some cases. So Gay-Williams has 5 objections. One is kind of a natural law argument, right? We have a natural instinct to survive. And if we go against natural law, generally speaking, that's wrong, right? We shouldn't violate natural instincts to survive. Wanting to keep going, wanting to be alive is natural, and what is natural is what we are meant to do. That is what is good. I'm not a big fan of natural law arguments myself. I think they're used to bad ends constantly. Back, I remember very distinctly, 15 years ago, back during the gay marriage debate in Canada, natural law arguments were brought up saying, it's marriage is kind of naturally designed between the biological realities of procreation. I think these are bad arguments. I find nature is not a guide to morality, generally speaking, but that's just me. I'm sorry to editorialize. I just don't like this first argument here. The second argument is a little bit better. It goes against human dignity, which we'll talk about in a later slide, but basically the idea is that intrinsic human dignity prevents something like active euthanasia. 3, it forecloses the possibility of a cure. In other words, we're never 100% sure that things won't kind of miraculously get better, that tomorrow they won't find a cure. And if you don't just try and survive right up until the end, in a way, you are foreclosing the possibility of getting better. What you should do is fight on right to the end, Gay Williams says. Right? In other words, the critically ill just might be giving up too early. And the most common one is number 5, the slippery slope argument. If you legalize active euthanasia, you're just opening up a can of worms, and where's it going to stop? Right? Next thing you know, we're going to have like death panels, and the government is going to decide whether Granny deserves to live or not because her treatment is going to cost X amount of dollars, and that's just wrong. That's kind of a slippery slope argument here. So let's walk through them a little bit. So yeah, basically Gay Williams is saying, euthanasia might seem like mercy, but it's in fact inherently wrong. From Nature and Dignity says, yeah, there's the first couple of arguments. Every human being, natural inclination to continue living. And euthanasia does violence to the natural goal of survival. Euthanasia sets us against our own nature, our own will to live. Dignity, human dignity comes from us seeking our ends. This is a very Kantian argument. When one of our goals is survival, because if you go back, what is the categorical imperative? The categorical imperative is fundamentally rooted in what must be willed, and what must be willed is at a minimum to continue existing, which requires rationality. When one of our goals is survival, and actions are taken to eliminate that goal, our natural dignity suffers. We're violating, in a sense, the categorical imperative, which is to kind of keep going. So again, this is one of those cases where if you have Kantian instincts, if you have deontological instincts, where you find the categorical imperative more compelling, you might have this kind of like, gut reaction to euthanasia as fundamentally wrong. However, if you have a utilitarian mindset, if you're more naturally inclined, as it were, to think about consequences, you're going to go like, of course, active euthanasia could be right sometimes. And I find it really fascinating because sometimes I'm in a classroom and I'll get people, 2 different students in the class. One of them was just like, of course, utilitarianism. The other one's, of course, Kant. And they never realize it, and they're just completely having different instincts, and they don't understand the other one. Like they each don't understand how could you think this? They think of each other. And just to abstract from that, right, there's 2 lessons here. One, you have to understand the other side to talk to them. You can't just go, that's dumb, you're wrong. And 2, we have to have a political and a legal system that conciliates and mediates these differences without fundamentally resolving them. Because maybe there'll never be a 100% answer to these moral questions. But what we definitely need is a system that allows us not to go to war over it. Death is final, Gay Williams says, and the chance of error too great to approve the practice of euthanasia. We may think we have no hope of recovery when, as a matter of fact, our chances are quite good. The very presence of the possibility of euthanasia may keep us from surviving when we might. So by being offered the choice, it might seem like a tempting choice, but in a way we're rolling the dice because the future is never certain. Death is certainly irreversible. I can say that with 100% certainty. Death is irreversible. What I can't say with certainty is that death is inevitable in my condition. Therefore, I should always, as a precaution, never choose death, because I can't admit I made a mistake after I died. Right. There's a similar case, we're going to talk about capital punishment. You might be talking about that with Ed during the second half of the class. But this is a common argument against capital punishment. Death is irreversible. However, we know people get falsely convicted of crimes that they didn't commit. But if you're dead, exoneration doesn't help you. If you're in jail, you can be freed. You can live out the rest of your life. You might even get a little bit of money to make up for it. Nothing could make up for losing 20 years of freedom. But there's no coming back from death. So likewise, you should never choose active euthanasia because the death is an irreversible certainty, whereas dying of your condition is not. Other argument. There's a corrupting influence, Gay Williams says. Was that on my list? Right. So euthanasia as a common practice may kind of change the approach of medical practitioners to death. They might make death kind of seem less bad, as if something that, is it one of the outcomes on the table amongst many, right? It's not something we should be feeling too badly about. If the patient dies, well, maybe they were better off dead. Maybe we should take the steps to make that come about, right? So what Gay Williams is saying here is that making euthanasia just one of the outcomes thinkable for a medical practitioner kind of will corrupt medicine. Because to be a good doctor, Gay Williams says, is to have death as never an option, because you're supposed to fight to the end. Finally, we have slippery slope, right? Let me just quote Jay Williams here. Euthanasia as a practice is a slippery slope. As a policy, a slippery slope. A person apparently hopelessly ill may be allowed to take his own life. Then maybe he'll be permitted to deputize others to do it for him, should he be no longer able to act. So now, the judgment of others becomes the ruling factor. But it's only a short step from there, from voluntary euthanasia to directed euthanasia, administered to a patient who has given no authorization, to involuntary euthanasia as just a part of social policy. So the idea is that, once you even allow the thought of active euthanasia to occur, even on a voluntary self-directed basis, right, there's a series of steps where it could just become social policy to euthanize people who are, not worthy to be continued to be alive. This might seem far-fetched in terms of actually getting the slippery slope, and sometimes slippery slope arguments are in fact fallacious. They're just fallacies. But that depends on the likelihood, I think, of each individual step occurring. So that's Gay Williams' argument here. And here's something. So I was reading The Economist when I was creating these slides a year back or so. And there's this really nice letter to the editor. Let me just read it to you, because here's an extra argument about euthanasia. Again, I won't tell you what I believe about the issue. I want you to make up your own minds in your own papers and the discussion forums. But there are times when giving someone a choice harms them. How can choice harm you? I thought this was a really interesting argument from this professor of philosophy in Eastern Illinois University. This happens in a case where an unchosen default is actually preferable to having a choice. The unchosen default position is better than having a choice. Some ethicists argue that giving the very ill the choice to commit suicide easily and legally harms all ill people by taking from them the option of continuing to live by default. We expect humans to provide reasons for their choices by requiring ill people to choose to live rather than just living by default. Such policies require them to justify their continued existence in a way that healthy people are not required to do. All right, so in a way, so what Waller is suggesting is that putting euthanasia, active euthanasia, on the table for very ill people is asking them to defend their choice. All right, so say, you could die or you can keep living. What do you think? Well, maybe I'll keep living. Really, why? Asking people that why question harms them. Waller says, because healthy people are never expected to justify their continued existence. So, all this to say, euthanasia is a really difficult moral issue to untangle, right? There's a number of issues here, like diagnostic uncertainty, as Gay Williams points out, right? We have issues of resource scarcity, of evaluating these kind of moral intangibles. What is human dignity really? What is the sanctity of life? What does that mean? A utilitarian might think the sanctity of life involves a reduction of suffering. That is how we honor life. Whereas a deontologist or a deeply religious person might really fundamentally disagree with this interpretation. Right? There are, of course, cultural and psychological factors. Right? A lot of people might be, if they're given the option of active euthanasia, might not really want to do it, but they might feel, I don't want to be a burden, and some emotions we don't want to be guiding the decision become a factor, like shame, right? And that might not be good. However, it seems the idea of individual suffering and patient autonomy, of refusing treatment, which we all agree should be okay, resulting in so much suffering, seems meaningless. If I can choose to cease treatment, and then I'll just suffer for 3 weeks, a month, rather than dying a painless death, Why shouldn't I, like, why should I just be forced to linger for a month? There's issues of informed consent. What does it mean to consent to something like this? Right? How are these things actually going to be administered? We need to look at case studies. What about places where this has been in practice for 10, 20 years? Have there been cases of abuse? Have elderly people, right, been kind of bullied into doing it? Like, what does it actually look like in practice? What about decision-making authority for people who can't make their decisions, right? What about key policy terms, right? How, as we define them, how does that affect the practice? All these together means euthanasia is a difficult and thorny ethical problem. One where doing nothing and not allowing it, or allowing passive euthanasia to quietly occur, is a policy decision itself, right? Because doing nothing is not actually doing nothing. It's allowing things to continue as they are, which is an action. So put all these together, you have a fascinating and difficult ethical problem, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it. All right, don't forget to do that online quiz number 2. I look forward to grading your papers. And after you're done online quiz number 2, take a couple days off, but then you need to do that midterm before the summer break. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll be back next Thursday for, I think there's one more week. Week 7 with me, then a break. So I'll see you next week.